Good morning. My name is Larry Klayman. I'm the chairman and general counsel of Freedom Watch, which I founded, and I'm also the founder of Judicial Watch. Freedom Watch is sponsoring this event today along with the Foundation for Democracy in Iran. It's an extremely important and timely event. The issue of Iran has been in the news for quite some time. The situation in Iran continues to worsen. Not only do we have violations of human rights, we have imprisonments, executions, rapes, torture, murder. We have the threat of nuclear weapons. And what we've learned and what we've seen is that the policy of appeasement of the Obama administration and the European Union has simply not worked. We are on the precipice of a significant crisis that could blow up at any time. We now have a new Congress. We have a House of Representatives that's controlled by the Republican Party. We call upon it and independent Democrats who are willing to exert themselves and others to push the administration and the European Union to pursue a more rational approach towards Iran. And that's what we're going to be exploring today, a rational approach to removing the regime, because nothing short of removal will solve the issue of human rights given the nature of that regime, which in my view is the equivalent, the modern-day equivalent of what we saw during World War II. And we also should remove that regime for the reason that the Persian people, the brave Persian people who have fought so hard for freedom and deserve it, need to be set free. And when they are set free, that country will become the natural ally of the United States, the West, and Israel. I am very proud to announce our first speaker here today, who is Jim Woolsey, former CIA director, distinguished individual, foreign policy expert, investment advisor, my friend. I turn the podium over to him. Thank you.
Thanks, Larry. Let me just say a few words to set the stage of where I think we are. In 1933, a regime came to power in Germany with the support of a substantial share of the German people, probably not a majority, that was increasingly insistent as the years from 1933 to 1939 rolled by, that the solution to the problems left in Europe in the aftermath of World War I and for a bright future for the entire continent was to kill all the Jews and conquer its region. Very few people took it seriously. There's a reason why Manchester's superb 3-volume Life of Winston Churchill has the title it does for Volume 2. Volume 2 covers the 1920s and the 1930s, and it's one word: alone. Because Churchill was almost entirely alone in insisting that Hitler meant what he said, and that the strategy of appeasement, which did not at that time have the negative connotation that it does today, that the strategy would be, many thought, successful and would be able to help contain and deal with the threats that Germany continued to make. At the beginning of the period, and probably up until or maybe even through 1936, Hitler was embarked upon the beginnings of an extraordinary military buildup. It was not a nuclear buildup, not yet, wasn't trying for that at that time. It was tanks, Panzers, Messerschmitts, Stuka dive bombers, and the like. During those first 2 or 3 years, there was substantial resistance to him among student groups, within the military, within the clergy. brave individuals who, one by one, were silenced or killed. And by, many observers say, 1936, when Germany moved into the Rhineland, it still would have been possible with firm British and French opposition, military opposition, for there to have been a coup in Germany, and probably led by, of all people, the Junkers, the Prussian aristocrats, and the many large numbers of them that served in the German military, many of whom were opposed to Hitler. But the world stood by. The world was in a terrible depression. The economies of Britain and France were such that they did not feel they could take a firm stand. The economic circumstances helped foster the doctrine of appeasement. And so appeasement was what there was until in 1938, Kristallnacht, the Holocaust effectively began, and in 1939, after forging a shocking and surprising to most of the world alliance with Stalin, Hitler began World War II. History doesn't repeat itself, Mark Twain once remarked, but it sometimes does rhyme. And the current situation and the way the West has dealt with it in Iran, sadly to me, rather rhymes with what was taking place in the 1930s. This time, it is a theocratic regime, at least theocratic in part. That may be fraying a bit. We'll chat about that in just a moment. But nonetheless totalitarian, a regime that pledges it can keep everything rolling well as long as it is free to kill all the Jews and dominate its region. A regime that, up until this point, has been something of a partnership between the supreme leader, first Khomeini and now Khamenei, and clerics on the one hand, and the secular authorities, various Iranian presidents, now Ahmadinejad on the other. But some things are crystallizing. First of all, the nuclear weapons program, which Iran has been engaged in for many years, is coming close to fruition. We don't know exactly when Iran will have a bomb. We do know that it has enough light-enriched uranium that if that uranium were heavily enriched, up to the 90% or so one needs for a nuclear weapon, they have enough light-enriched uranium to make enough heavy enriched uranium for a bomb or two, and depending on the status of their centrifuges and the cascading, perhaps before too long, more. By the way, once you have enriched uranium to 5%, the level that you need for power plants, fuel, you've done about 2/3 to 3/4 of the work you need to do to enrich it up to 90% weapons grade. You haven't done 5% of the work. You've done about 2/3 to 3/4 of the work because of the way the curves turn for those physical processes. So we are at a point where Iran may very soon begin to feel its oats, as Hitler felt his around 1936 or so as he moved into the Rhineland, bolstered by his military buildup. We have a situation in which the Revolutionary Guard and the Basij, sometimes feuding but more or less together under Ahmadinejad's leadership, are more and more a factor in society and the economy of Iran. The clerics are becoming worried, nervous. not only the traditional bazaris, but the clerics. And one report in the paper this morning, Secretary of Defense Gates mentioning yesterday possible tensions between Ahmadinejad and Khamenei. It is something like having the black shirts and the brown shirts running the German economy in the early to mid 1930s, to have the Basij and the Revolutionary Guard moving into positions of such authority and power. Not only do they control the streets as killers and rapists, but they also control important chunks of the Iranian economy, including major portions of the energy business, certainly have their own small navy of small boats, have their own forces, the Al-Quds force that operates in neighboring countries, Afghanistan and Iraq in particular, killing Americans, among others. And this has been going on for years, supplying IEDs to Iraqi dissidents and to the Taliban, and the wherewithal and knowledge of how to make them. And we have a situation in which the West, and including the United States, for the last number of years, has made Chamberlain and Daladier look somewhat decisive. We have for years said in the United States and certainly in Europe, if we just engage with the Iranian government, we can work all this out. Engage is an interesting word. It has more than one connotation, but at least one of them is to get engaged to be married, which is probably not what the advocates of engagement mean. The other is to engage as gears engage, so they mesh perfectly, and the drivetrain transfers energy to the wheels because the gears mesh perfectly. If that is the image that the advocates of engagement have in mind, it is particularly naive. If what they mean is simply to talk, all right, there are circumstances in which one can and should talk to enemies, but one does it or should do it from a position of strength. Otherwise, that enemy will interpret the very act of talking as weakness. And this is certainly the way Ahmadinejad and those around him interpret our persistent calls for engagement. Are we likely to be able to stop the Iranian nuclear program or to change the nature of the regime, or both, through what we are doing now? The one bright spot is that we have finally, within the last very few months, begun to get a bit serious about sanctions. But this is after years of the most irresolute and weak approach through the United Nations, particularly of levying real effective sanctions on Iranian government behavior and the operation of the Iranian state. They're killing Americans in neighboring countries. They're building their nuclear weapons program and the rest. Finally, I would say I do think the administration has taken some useful steps in the last few weeks, and congressional action has helped as well, on sanctions, but it may well be too late.